So rage becomes her. Why this book and why now? Why did you write this?
I wrote it as an almost State of the Union for how women move through the stages of their lives in an atmosphere that's often quite hostile and that elicits negative emotional responses that are not particularly welcome, and that affects our personal lives, our professional lives, and our politics. And so, honestly, anger became the vehicle through which to talk about those issues specifically after the election. Anger was just so palpable in the build-up to the election. It continues to be today. And so it seems like a good filter through which to look at the broader issues.
Mm. What do you think when there are these calls for civility? And it seems like that's the way to police the anger of resistance, while, of course, there's no such policing on the other side. How do you respond to that when people say that in politics the problem is not that things are too that the problem is not apathy or whatnot. The problem is that things are too polarized and we need civility as a way to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things. One is I hear this, and I've heard this for months now in the build up to just having this book released, is that we don't need more rage in the world. There's plenty of anger in the United States. And what I find interesting about that and its relation to this notion of civility is that I'm not saying make more anger. What we're saying is the anger is here. And if you can say that people need to be more civil, it's really my response is, well, that's nice for you. But in fact, what we're trying to say here very clearly is that we're angry about very specific things and that it's time to really stop and listen to what we're saying. And the call for civility, as you say, it often comes down to a sort of tone policing, like, oh, don't be rude, don't be vulgar. There's a lot that is implied about, especially for women, cursing, right? So I don't take a lot of store in that, especially when the incivility is so prominent, as you say, so evident on the other side.
Mm. And there's this whole history, of course, of particularly policing the anger of women and referring to it in ways that are that diminutize the issues that they're trying to raise.
Yeah, I mean, when you minimize women's anger, when you trivialize their mode of expression, you at the same time sort of simultaneously do that to the content of what they're saying. And that happens, it really, and I tried to cite as much as I could in the book studies that show how early in life this begins, how early the mischaracterization and recharacterization of girls and women's speech and feelings happens. So very often people will attribute sadness to a woman who's angry, because the idea that she's angry is quite transgressive.
Mm.
But the idea that she's sad is not.
Now, this is a sports and politics podcast, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you if you could connect the general thesis in your book with everything that happened in the response with Serena Williams and the policing of her anger at the U.S. Open.
It's amazing because, you had this few minutes really of sort of catalytic emotion and tension that escalated. And for some people watching, the escalation was just obvious. It was evident. It was something that we're familiar with in our own lives. And it was maybe obviously not obvious to other people who were like, well, she's just a tennis player, and men get angry all the time and they get sanctioned, and more men have been sanctioned in the sport than women, with no reference to proportionality, but we'll ignore that for right now. But, I think it's clear, for example, in the fact that she's been levied the largest U.S. Open fine for verbal abuse ever. I mean, she was fined $10,000, which is kind of gobsmacking given the very evident displays of explosive sort of and threatening and obscene outbursts that are in all of these compilations of men tennis players that are running around. But, I think that the bigger conversation about how Black women's anger is perceived and treated is the most important thing coming out of this episode.
Can you speak more about that, please?
Well, there are all of these myths and tropes about angry Black women, particularly in American culture, but they extend to places like the UK and really globally. But this idea that Black women are threatening and vulgar and ugly and just naturally, quote unquote, angrier than other people and hostile and defensive, and the origins of that stereotype come from some pretty racist media. Amos and Andy, for example, I think had characters of men that pretended to be Black women acting in these ways. And it means that in daily life, Black women are constantly having to be self-aware and aware about how they speak, how they look, how they move, how they present themselves, even in situations where righteous indignation or self-defense are necessary. And that starts really early. It starts in kindergarten, where we see that, young Black girls are far more likely to be expelled and suspended. And by the time they're, I think in high school, they're 5 times more likely to be disciplined and expelled. And some of that just comes from the fact that as young Black girls, they can never really meet the standards of sort of a white, fragile femininity that is the norm in many parts of the country.